In this lesson, we're going to be covering off conditions used within JavaScript. And we've briefly looked at conditions before throughout some previous lessons. And in this lesson, we're going to explain in more detail how conditions are used in JavaScript. So for conditions, we have the option to do an if statement, we can do an else statement, we can do an else if statement. We also have the ability to do this shorthand version where we're doing a condition, and if the condition's met, then we set one value, and if the condition's not met, then we set another value. And besides just doing regular conditional statements, we also have switch and case available to us. So let's open up our editor and see what we can make happen using JavaScript conditions. So I've already got all of these defaults in place here. So I've got my two clickable buttons. So I'm going to just relabel this to button 1, and I'm going to relabel this one to button 2, so that they're a lot easier to identify here. And then of course I've got my output there, so output 1 and output 2. So right now we're just outputting nothing. So maybe what I'm going to do here as well is I'm going to add a class. So O class, and then update that class up here. And I'm going to add some padding around it. It's not a lot of padding, add a margin around it as well. So it's easier to differentiate the two boxes there. And maybe make the font a little bit bigger. So font size, and make it 18 pixels. So let's refresh it and see what this looks like. So this now it's going to be more visible, and maybe we'll even change the color of it to make it red. So that's very, very visible there. So now we've got our two output containers, and we're ready to go to start setting some conditions. Now, as I said, we have briefly looked at conditions previously, and maybe let's take a look at a condition and do a comparison here. So at the root of it, a condition is very straightforward. So we've got our first parameter, we've got the operator there. So in this one, we're comparing A to B. And then maybe we're going to have something happen here. So I'm just going to simply update that output and the inner HTML of that output. So A is equal to B. So this is relatively straightforward. So let's take a look at this. And when we click button 1, we don't actually see anything happening, and that's because A is not equal to B. So if we do something like A not equal to B and refresh it, now we see A, well, it says equal, but we should just update that to be not equal. So now if we have any numbers and if they're not equal and we press the button, then we get this not equal to B. But if we don't meet this condition, then we don't see anything happening. So this takes us to the point where we need to actually build out some additional functionality. So we want to have, and this is where else comes into play. And just as the name indicates, else gives us another option. So if A is not equal to B, that must mean that A is equal to B. So I'm going to just update these a little bit, and I'm going to switch this around so that if this condition is true, A is equal to B, we're going to run out that first set of code, and then if this isn't true, then of course we've got else, and else will just output that it's not equal to B. So this time things are going to work a little bit better. So until A equals B, we're not going to see this A equaling to B. So as long as we've got different values, so it doesn't matter what the values are, as long as they're equal to each other, they're still going to equal out. Let's try something interesting here. So I'm going to remove out this parse, changing B to an integer, and we're going to keep B as a string value. So remember before when we looked at this, we see that They're string values, but we're still seeing that A is equal to B. And that's because we're not actually comparing the type. So we need to add a third equal sign to do a comparison of the type. So this time, when we're both equaling to 33, we see that A is not equal to B because the type is different. And we're asking for that type to be more specific in order to equal that out. So this is making an additional check. So that third equal sign essentially makes an additional check to see if the type is the same. And of course, we know that from previously that when we parse integer, we're changing this value to be numeric, and then we're changing this value, or we're leaving this value as a string, and that just means that the type is not the same, because one's a number or an integer, and the other one's a string. So the types are not the same. And that's where you see that third equal sign when you want to make sure that the numbers are absolutely the same.